My guest today is Adam Zivo, investigative journalist, columnist for the National Post, and director at the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. We discuss his experience as an on-the-ground journalist in Ukraine, the many misconceptions about the Russian invasion in the region, and how the West has been propagandized to believe untrue narratives about this war. Adam provides an illuminating glimpse into a conflict that many of us still know little about, and dispels a number of myths propagated by political actors on social media platforms. This is an eye-opening conversation that changed my own perspective on the world I thought I knew. Stay tuned. Adam, back again, man. It's good to see you.
It's good to talk to you. How you been?
I'm good, man. I mean, I was saying this to Sam the other day, but I'll say it to you too. You guys like you scare the shit out of me. So that's pretty much how I live my life, reading your articles and going, oh man, it's all over.
Yeah. I mean, admittedly, Canada is a little bit broken. We're giving out drugs to the kids. We're letting international adversaries flood our communities with fentanyl. It's not great. We could be doing better, but we're not. And hopefully, Sam and I, by calling some public attention, this can push for change. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but we're trying our best.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are doing a fantastic job. Your guys' work is, I'd say, the best work being produced in this country right now. You guys are part of a very small club of actual real journalists who don't, just say things for the sake of clicks. You guys are pushing against the grain and bringing people real information. So, you guys are a rare breed. Unfortunately, real journalism is disappearing. So, I commend both you guys for everything you do.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind thing to say.
So today, order of business today, we talked offline after our last conversation, and you had mentioned that you had spent a period of your life living in Ukraine, and you have a very unique experience there and a very unique perspective on what's happening in that part of the world. So can you start by talking about what led you to living in Ukraine, how long you were there, and just a general summary of your experiences there?
Sure. I'll tell it chronologically. So essentially, before the war in Ukraine, I was, writing as a columnist for the National Post, but I also had a day job as a technical writer at some large company, and it paid well, but it was also not fulfilling. I was editing these reports that I didn't think were that important, to be honest, and I didn't think that anyone really read or even understood, and I wanted something more. And then I remember the war in Ukraine happened. Russia invaded. I'd been writing material about Ukraine in the weeks preceding that. It mattered a lot to me, and I was sitting on my couch and I thought, well, what more can I do? Because just writing articles from Toronto seems insufficient. And then I thought to myself, you know what? Fuck it. Why don't I just go to Poland? You know what? Like, this was in February, and I'd been planning to go to Mexico for vacation, but the thought of just getting shit-faced on some resort seemed a little bit unfulfilling. So I decided, why don't I just use my vacation days and just go to Poland instead? And I asked my job. They said, sure. My family was not happy about this. They said, oh, we hope that you'll be safe. Don't get injured. Because this was in the very beginning, and we didn't know how much the war would spill over, right? And they thought that being in Poland would be dangerous. And I said, guys, it's just Warsaw. Like, how bad could it be? And I arrived in Warsaw, and I saw all of the mothers and all of the children getting out of the train station. And the first time I saw that, I cried. The number of children you saw at that station, and just like the looks in their eyes, was terrible. No child should have to look so weary and tired. And at that point, I knew that, this is something that I wanted to commit myself to in some way. And I started interviewing volunteers. I interviewed a whole bunch of really wonderful Polish volunteers who had taken it upon themselves to support these refugees, these women and children, given that the Polish government's response was not as efficient as it could be. But over time, Warsaw, they had this big refugee crisis, but there wasn't much else happening beyond that, right? Just how do we accommodate the refugees? And I needed to go closer to the ground. So I said, okay, I'm just going to go and take a train to the Polish-Ukrainian border. And of course, my mom was not happy about that. She's like, why are you going to the Polish-Ukrainian border? You said that you just be in Warsaw. How do I know that you're going to be safe? And I said, it's okay, Mom. I'm not going to go to Ukraine itself. That would be insane. Who would do that?
Right,
um,
right.
and then I arrived, at the border crossing. And once again, just this endless flood of just thousands upon thousands of refugees, just vulnerable women, children. And it was awful. And I decided to go and actually enter Ukraine because I was like, I want to see more. So, sorry, Mom. So I hitchhiked with some volunteers. They were driving material in, and I arrived in Lviv, which is a city of about 750, 800,000 people, just by the Polish border. And at the time, I thought, that Lviv would be highly dangerous or that it wouldn't have any food. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate how big of a country Ukraine is and how the experiences of war differ from region to region. And when I arrived in Lviv, it was, relatively peaceful because once again, like this is way in the West and the war was happening in the East. So there was a giant refugee crisis and there were just floods of people everywhere. But, overall things were still working. And this was important because this was essential to ensuring that the economy still functioned, because economic collapse would essentially, prevent Ukraine from being able to resist this invasion. And I thought to myself, Lviv is one of the most beautiful cities I've ever seen. There is this stereotype that, Ukraine and Eastern Europe more generally is, I don't know, some backward shithole or whatever. There's a lot of Western chauvinism towards Eastern Europe. And I realized that all of my negative perceptions of Ukraine were wrong. Just like it was a great city. It was a beautiful city, even in the midst of war. And I knew I wanted to see more of it. And I wanted to understand what Ukraine was. So I came back to work and, came back to Toronto. And I said, I want to follow up on this. I want to do more reporting in Ukraine. And I asked my boss, can I work remotely from Ukraine? And of course they said no, which is understandable.
Right.
And then a few hours later, I submitted in my resignation. I said, fuck it, I'm just going to go. And if I, lose a whole bunch of my income, that's fine. I'll figure it out. I need to do something that means something morally. So I flew back to Lviv in April of 2022. And once again, Lviv was like relatively safe. Because it is like really on the west. And then around this time was when Bucha was liberated. So essentially the Russians had surrounded Kyiv on three sides, and then the Ukrainians had successfully pushed them back. And I decided to go to Kyiv. And I had previously, of course, promised my family, I'll just stay in Lviv, it'll be fine, and I was like, I'm in Kyiv now. I'm pretty sure, I don't know why my family still talks to me. Like honestly. and so when I got in Kyiv, it was fucked up, right? So you're talking about this beautiful capital that used to have 3.5 million people, and it was empty. 10% of people were there, maybe 20. Empty streets, no cars on the road, military checkpoints everywhere. I remember at one point, you get stopped sometimes just to check your phone because they don't want saboteurs around. And so they were checking my phone. And I was like, oh my God, please don't see my nudes. Like, I was like, you have been through enough. This is the least thing. Right. But essentially, the city was, I mean, the martial environment there was very strong, but they had survived and they had pushed away the Russians, and life was slowly coming back to the city. And every single day you would see more and more life there and a kind of reopening. And I managed to connect with some volunteers, and we went to Bucha. And at the time, they were still demining it. So we had to be careful about where we went, right? Mm-hmm. So we had to be like, okay, this place is demined, it's fine, whatever. And the group that I was with, they were cleaning kindergartens that had been destroyed and other public buildings. And so, you go to this kindergarten. It was the first one. There were a few that we went to. And all the glass is broken. Everything is broken. You see bullet holes and shrapnel holes beside children's books, beside dolls. You see the chairs with the kids' names on it. And you can't see that and not feel angry. These kids who had just been trying to live in peace, just growing up, and now their entire life is fucked up, and they've now had to flee to Poland or somewhere, right? There was this one time, the second floor of this school, there were a string of like butterflies that they had cut out of paper. And so, half the classroom has butterflies, half the classroom doesn't, just, strung out over the windows. And then you see the cutouts on the ground scattered everywhere. And you're like, oh, they were in the middle of an art project. And then in came fucking Russian soldiers and occupied this territory. There was graffiti, vandalism. They shit on the floors of the school before they left, I guess as a message. The Ukrainians have like a national shirt, like it's part of their cultural traditions, called the Vyshyvanka. In one school, the soldiers had, very deliberately used the Vyshyvankas as toilet paper and wiped their asses with it. They had vandalized the school, and it was terrible. And it was terrible, speaking with people who had been under occupation. They talked about how the Russians would just, shoot randomly into apartment buildings. And it was fucked up. And then, of course, I met friends who had experienced those first few weeks quite intensely. One of my friends, Dima, he was in Bucha when it was occupied. And, he was there with his two grandmothers, and there were tanks in the area. And after a few days, they decided to flee. So he escorted them south over corpses and got back to Ukrainian-held territory. And so over corpses and through shelling, he had to escort his two old grandmothers. And one of them couldn't properly walk, so he had to carry her for kilometers at a time. And then he cried when he got back to Ukrainian-held territory. And by the time I met him, he was like disassociated. He said, I feel like I'm watching my life through a film. It doesn't feel real. And then after 2 weeks, things were starting to get somewhat normal-ish. Businesses were reopening. And I decided to go to Kharkiv. And Kharkiv is a city, it used to be 1.5 million people. It's about 40 kilometers from the Russian border. And I had an acquaintance there who was running a humanitarian aid project where they were doing last mile delivery for medication. So essentially, the larger humanitarian organizations, they were bringing in material, but they were too afraid to get to the villages, at the last mile where they needed medicine the most. So what these volunteers were doing was that they would accept these donations, sort through them. Many of them were pharmacists, like many of the volunteers were pharmacists or had some kind of medical background. And they created a system where people who were in liberated villages or surrounding areas could just, ask for prescription drugs, and they would go and deliver it. So to make sure that the resources are efficiently allocated. So anyways, I show up in Kharkiv. Kharkiv had been shelled throughout the day. Throughout most of the war. And it was the kind of thing where they had been shelling downtown for weeks on end. And then 2 weeks before I arrived, they pushed the Russians back a fair amount. So because the Russians were farther, they were just shelling the northern suburbs of the city, but downtown was relatively fine. And so whereas people had been living in the subway system for weeks on end, now they were clearing people out of there and reopening the subway and trying to resume living in some way, because you can't put life on pause forever. And I remember when I first arrived, I was shocked. I mean, I wasn't shocked. I knew what to expect, but it's a different thing when you see it in real life. You get out of the train station and everything is destroyed. All the windows are broken. All the buildings show sign of damage. Every street has a building that is partially collapsed in some way. And why? For what? And, I was walking down there, and then I booked an Airbnb, because you can still do that. It's very cheap. And actually, it was like $15 a night. I was like, okay, do this on a budget. I couldn't find any food or water, but I could find an Airbnb. And eventually things were reopening. And the apartment that I was staying in, so actually a Torontonian had been living there for the previous few years. He was this guy, Isa, who had moved to Ukraine because of the cost of living, and like had worked in IT remotely, fell in love with a Ukrainian woman, and lived in Kharkiv. And then the war happened, and he fled, of
Right.
course. And he fled, and then his landlord was like, "Well, I need to make some money. Can I Airbnb it?" And he said, "Sure." And then Isa got in contact with me and said, "I have some diaries like in my apartment. Can you bring them back?" And I was like, "Sure." So I was like, "Oh, great! You know, this is like something out of a film. You know, I have to return this guy's diaries from the war-torn city."
Right.
Yeah, I mean, but the whole thing was super fucked up. Every single night, every single night, just air raid siren, air raid siren, air raid siren, explosion, explosion, explosion. And it's like thunder all the fucking time, all the time, and during the day too. And still, people still lived. They found a way to live, even if the city was 80% abandoned at this time. So looping back to what happened earlier, I joined that friend who was doing the last mile deliveries. We went to a hospital for children that had been largely abandoned. I mean, many of the doctors fled because they don't want to die, but there were some terminally ill kids who could not be relocated, and they were trying to take care of them as best as they could while being shelled. Not easy. And after that, you know, we were still like fairly safe. We were still fairly within the center of the city. And they said, "We're going to make a delivery to like one of the liberated villages to the north. It's closer to the lines. Do you want to come?" And I said, "How dangerous is it? Is this like, I need something that is dangerous enough to titillate my readers, but not so dangerous that I have to worry about dying." Like,
Yeah, your mom might be a little bit upset about that.
Yeah. And they're like, "Yeah, it should be fine." You know, like obviously it's not safe, but like it's nothing so bad is going to happen. And I was like, okay. So I borrowed a helmet. I had a bulletproof vest already. I was gifted it by a friend. And so we're driving north. The highway is completely empty. I mean, you know, no traffic, so we get to where we need to go quickly. And there's just checkpoint after checkpoint every few kilometers, and everything is totally silent. There's no, you know, no wildlife making any noises, nothing like that. All you hear is just the boom, 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 getting louder and louder and louder the closer you go. And you get anxious when you hear that. I didn't realize how anxious I was until I realized in the videos that I'd taken, like I was like looking everywhere. We had a military escort. So it was like one car was like with the volunteers. So it was myself. It was some like two old Spanish ladies. I call them the war abuelitas. So they just randomly would go to like places like Syria and Iraq, now Ukraine, you know, helping people. They worked for an organization called Olvidados, which is the Forgotten, and they go where no one else would go. And then we had another car that was filled with military men just to make sure that we were safe. And so, you know, we stopped by some tank that had been destroyed. And it's like, you have 60 seconds to look at this, then we're going. And that's exactly how it worked. It was like clockwork. It's like you feel the timer in your head. And then we stopped by this bridge, and the bridge had been destroyed by the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians from coming in. Right. And it's like, you know, we have just a few minutes to look at this, and then we have to go to the village. And we're there, you know, taking a quick look. And, you know, there's no cover or anything like that. And then we hear a boom, like a loud ass boom, and we hear it in the trees, like over there. I'm like, oh, they're shelling at us because we're the only thing that is alive in this area. So they have launched a shell. They've seen us. They've launched a shell at us, and they missed, which is great that they missed because otherwise we'd be dead. And, you know, I'm not a fan of dying. It's not something that I want on my itinerary. And we just like, we're like, oh shit. So, you know, we went to the car and we got off as quickly as we could. And I had thought that having a press vest on and the fact that we were wearing, you know, bright orange vests would do something. But apparently, you know, it's very well known amongst journalists and in working in Ukraine that you should actually take your press indicators off because the Russians specifically target you if you're press to kill you. So that was not great. So then we drive off as quickly as we can. We get a flat tire along the way, so we're stuck in like a suburb for half an hour. Soldier says, "I've been baptized. We've all been baptized." And I was like, okay, it's questionable achievements. And they decide to take us through a detour through Dergachi, which is like a small town just north of Kharkiv. So it's a small detour, and they want to show us there's this community center that had been where hundreds of people had been sheltering. And the Russians had sent a missile in the previous week and blown it up and killed a whole bunch of people there. So they want us to see, so we could understand. And when you see it, you understand. Here's this big building, 4 or 5 stories tall, huge community center, same as what you would see in many parts of Canada. And there was just a big hole in it, a big black hole where people used to shelter. And a whole bunch of them had died. And apparently, like, when the missile hit, there were like limbs everywhere. And we're standing there, and then we hear another explosion. And so the Russians were randomly shelling this town, as they always do. And we saw a plume of smoke about 200 meters away, and the shelling was like big enough that you could feel it on your skin. It triggered a car alarm, and we got the fuck out. And yeah, I ended up, just, that was a bit traumatizing. I didn't want to admit at the time, but it kind of was. I remember when I was back in Canada for Canada Day and there were fireworks, I got really anxious and I was like, I need to be inside. And then, you just hear all of these explosions, and I spent a few nights sleeping in the bathtub, just in case. And then afterwards I went to Odessa because it just didn't feel safe, and the Russians started shelling downtown again. I was at a restaurant, and, of course, they only have a few dishes available. Most of the ingredients can't get into the city. And they say, yeah, can you guys pay up right now? Like, there was like the lights flickered off. The waiter comes in and says, hey, can you guys like pay up right now? We're shutting down for the day. Our sister restaurant 20 minutes from here just got shelled. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
It's understandable. So I went to Odessa, and Odessa had been bombed a number of times in the very beginning of the war. And by the time I arrived, it was relatively safe because the front line was 2 hours to the east. And I wanted to get closer to the front lines, but I didn't have permission because I only had a bulletproof vest and I didn't have my own helmet. And they're like, well, if you don't have a helmet, you can't go to Mykolaiv, which is the city that was in the east. So, I had some free time. I interviewed a smuggler. So there's this woman, very brave. She would bribe Russian soldiers to get into occupied territory, to get in Kherson, and she would smuggle people out. And, I interviewed someone who had been under occupation and spoke about the terrors of occupation, of people just randomly disappearing, of just the martial violence there, the fear of living there. It was really bad. And I had some free time. And so then I went on a dating app because honestly, it's a great way to get to know locals. And I was like, I will find some local Ukrainian who will like show me around the city and like help me see the city. Because honestly, you know what? I've traveled a lot, and this is one of the best ways to actually get to see a city from a local's perspective.
Right.
And then I saw this guy. He was incredibly beautiful. I thought he was a catfish at first. I was like, there's no way this person is real. And then he was real. And I was like, what's the catch? Is he really stupid? Like, does he kill puppies? Like there has to be something wrong. And no, we met, and it was beautiful. Like, just, we walked all day. It was the best date of my life. And I, we hung out basically every day afterwards. And I was completely smitten, and he was completely smitten. And I was like, well, this is an unexpected development. And on the final day, when I was about to head back to Canada, I told him, hey, you know what? I've cherished every moment that I've spent with you. And I want to come back and be with you. I want to spend more time with you, but I also can't promise that I can come back to Ukraine, even if I want to, because it's hard. So I will make an effort to come back, but also, don't wait for me because I don't want to disappoint you. And, he said this. He said he would wait for me though. And we talked about how great this week had been. And then, then the train leaves and I watch him as, the train's going away. And I come back to Canada and I end up moving to Ukraine. 6 weeks later.
Wow.
And that's sort of how I ended up in Ukraine and living in Ukraine for like over a year.
Wow, that's amazing. So I know this isn't the end of the story. This is just the beginning. But what a journey. That's intense and lovely and beautiful all at the same time. So I got to ask you, what's the general Ukrainian perspective on the geopolitical situation that led to Russia invading their country?
Well, I mean, they're begging for Western assistance, and many of them
Right.
are frustrated by the patronizing narratives often employed to undermine support for Ukraine. There's this notion that um, like Ukraine was being pressured into entering NATO, which is not an accurate one. We have to keep in mind that Eastern European countries were begging to enter NATO. It's not as if NATO was like, "Hey, you should come, and we're going to annex you." They're like, "Actually, we were under Russian occupation for decades. We remember what it was like to be under the Russian Empire. We remember what it was like to be under the Soviet Empire. It was really shitty. They killed our intellectual leaders. They massacred us. When we tried to be independent, they sent tanks into our capitals. So we would not like that, you know. So we would like to join a defensive alliance so that if Russia tries to invade us again, well, then we'll have someone to protect us."
Mm-hmm.
So Poland, the Baltic states, other Eastern European countries, they were very adamant about that. And Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Ukrainians wanted to be part of NATO. But then the West was too cautious and was like, no, 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 this could provoke Russia, yada, yada, yada. Angela Merkel, in particular, was like a very big opponent of it because, of course, she wanted to make sure that Russia was happy so that the Germans could have easy access to gas imports because the Germans love getting cheap gas for their economy. And you know what? Like the Germans and the Russians previously collaborated to divide Eastern Europe in the 1940s. So why not do it again, but in a more informal way? Um, so for them, they just kind of they see this as they see this as being kind of just like the natural extension of Russia's multi-century attempt to assimilate the Ukrainians in general and to dominate Eastern Europe as well. Uh, so they don't blame the West. They wish that the West had done more. They wish that the West had taken this more seriously, because Russia has been warring with Ukraine since 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this bullshit narrative that 2014 was a coup, that Maidan was a coup. No one who I've spoken to has taken that narrative seriously, including many people who took part in that revolution. And they find the narrative kind of condescending because it's like, well, all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainians protesting on the streets, demanding a change in government because they see their government as being corrupt, right? Back in 2014, because they wanted to westernize. They wanted to go and join the EU, and then Yanukovych tears up the association agreement randomly in exchange, basically for what is a giant bribe from Russia, and people are pissed off. And so they come in and they do their best. And then, you have some people in the West saying, oh, it's all manipulated by the CIA. And many Ukrainians are like, well, you may want to consider that we actually can think for ourselves. And not everything that we do, it's not as if we're just the puppets of the CIA. It's very condescending. It basically denies anyone's agency. And yeah, so they've just kind of been like fighting, against Russia and been very frustrated. I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that Russia's aggression towards Ukraine is not a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when Russia controlled Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire, they tried to ban the Ukrainian language. They banned any expression of Ukrainian culture. So you couldn't speak Ukrainian. If you wrote a play about, the Ukrainian identity, you couldn't perform that. Essentially, they were colonizing the place, trying to erase Ukrainian identity and Russify the people.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people who speak Russian, much in the same way how there's a lot of people who speak French in North Africa. So, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. I'm kind of
No. That's
Yeah.
really informative. You answered exactly what I was looking for here. Because I know a little bit of the history, and I know that Ukraine holds significant historical and traditional importance to Russia, right, from a Slavic perspective. And Ukraine, as in terms of geopolitical positioning, is also important to Russia because it's the pathway into Russia, right, through the rest of Europe. And I mean, there's other pathways, but it's one of them. And so I haven't, with any war, it's always difficult to really analyze what's happening because there's brutality on both sides. There's horrific events that occur. There's things that happen that shouldn't happen. And, I'm an outside observer. You're a guy who was there on the ground. So I think your opinion and your perspective is much more valuable than my own. And I'm not a Russia apologist or anything like that. I think Vladimir Putin is a brutal, vicious leader. Now, I just want to, I guess I got to ask then. So it's the memory of what Ukraine endured as part of the Soviet Union under Stalin that kind of keeps them resisting and more leaning toward the West then. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, we have to keep in mind that Stalin engineered a famine that killed millions of Ukrainians, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then tried to hide the evidence that this was a very specifically anti-Ukrainian thing. So essentially here, let me just give you like the history lesson here, right? So the Russian Empire was very anti-Ukrainian and very chauvinistic, basically said Russians are the best and everyone else has to Russify. So that in come the Bolsheviks, they start the Soviet Union. And initially, they want to change their attitude towards ethnic minorities. And they say, we're not the Russian Empire, we're the Soviet Union, we're more cosmopolitan. We're going to be this multi-ethnic empire that shows that socialism can be for everyone, regardless of what ethnicity you're from, right? They were forward thinking in that way. And so in the 1920s, there was a lot of emphasis on allowing ethnic minorities to express their identities and even supporting them in that. So if you were a scholar in Ukraine, you could go and study the Ukrainian language and try to, I guess, codify it or I guess like record it. There was investment into Ukrainian plays. It was all about supporting this idea that, supporting Ukrainian nationalism so that it could be integrated into the Soviet political project. Now, the problem, though, is that when you support Ukrainian nationalism, as what often happens when you have a multi-ethnic empire, is that national consciousness emerges and they say, well, why are we governed by people who are not us? Mm-hmm. And so by the 1930s, Ukrainian nationalism was seen as a threat to Russian hegemony and as a threat to Soviet unity. So they changed their policies and decided to stifle any expression of Ukrainian nationalism. So, for example, the very scholars who had previously been commissioned to study the Ukrainian language were suddenly accused of inventing differences between Ukrainian and Russian, coming up with false letters, because Ukraine has some letters that are not found in Russian. They were accused of inventing that out of thin air. So they got fucked over, right? They were just kind of doing what the Soviet Union told them to do in the 1920s, and they got punished for it because that's what happens when you have an autocracy like that. And then there was a general famine in the Soviet Union throughout the 1930s. So we shouldn't pretend like other parts didn't suffer. But the famine in the Soviet Union particularly impacted two regions, Ukraine and Kazakhstan. I'm not familiar with the Kazakhstan situation, but what I do know in Ukraine, and this is detailed in very, very, very thoroughly by a good book called The Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. He's one of the foremost historians on this, is that essentially Stalin thought that any evidence of famine in Ukraine was a plot by Ukrainian nationalists to embarrass the Soviet Union. And he would literally say, oh, you see that starving child with a big bloated belly. He's starving himself intentionally to embarrass the Soviets. There was no shortage of mental gymnastics that they would go to try to avoid the fact that actually there is a famine here and it's real. And it's not just the Ukrainian nationalists coming up with a conspiracy. And so in an attempt to root out, quote unquote, Ukrainian nationalism, Stalin put in a few different policies. So, for example, you had entire villages that were blacklisted, which means that they weren't allowed to receive any farming tools, any food. So they were essentially condemned to death. And, whatever grain was produced in Ukraine, a lot of it was requisitioned for export to pay off loans for industrialization in the Soviet Union. So essentially, Moscow took the Ukraine took food from the Ukrainians so they could pay for their debts, and then let them all
Mm.
starve. And we have to keep in mind that this was only a few decades ago, and there are Ukrainians who have family members who lived through this. My boyfriend, his grandparents only survived the Holodomor because they had some seeds that had been lodged in their straw roof in their huts, right? So they were able to hide seeds and eat seeds in their roof. So this is
Mm.
very real, right? As much in the same way that Jewish people remember the Holocaust and are sensitive towards that, the Ukrainians very much think about the Holodomor. And if Germany were to be hostile to Jews today, I think obviously, Jewish people will be like, oh, well, remember what happened in the Holocaust, so we're going to be really careful here. Well,
Yeah.
now you have Russia, which is invading Ukraine, saying that Ukraine is not a real nation and that it needs to be, forcibly integrated into Russia. And so for a lot of Ukrainians, of course, they think, well, we know what happened the last time we had this union, so we have to survive.
Yeah, man, it's just so brutal, especially in that part of the world where there's so much history, right? And there are so many things that have occurred over the decades and over the years. Like even, you were talking about the requisitioning, and I completely forgot about that. I was thinking about China when you were talking about it, because they did the exact same thing. They exported all of their food and their agricultural products to Russia in exchange for industrialization. So yeah, I'm sorry, man. I'm just there's a lot to go after here. So with what do you make of figures like Victoria Nuland and people in the American deep state who were recorded actually selecting the Ukrainian government after the revolution? Do you think there's anything to that? Do you think they're just giving input, or are they actually selecting a government? Because that's really what triggered that theory that it's the U.S. State Department who was selecting Zelensky and his cabinet. So what do you make of that aspect?
I mean, I haven't followed that story in any detail. I know that any journalist who's working on the ground or any serious political analyst doesn't really put any seriousness behind this idea that this is, that Ukrainian government is controlled by the American government or anything like that. I'd have to look into the story that you just described. I've heard it being mentioned sometimes as a piece of disinfo.
Okay.
But I think, the greatest way to illustrate the freedom of Ukrainian democracy, or I guess its chaoticness, is the fact that Zelensky was elected, because he was not an insider. He was an outsider. His entire people, servant to the People Party, they were all outsiders who had no political experience. And so essentially what happened is that after the 2014 Maidan revolution happened, there was this appetite for political change, right? Because, people didn't like Yanukovych, and they wanted something new. But then what happened is that you have, Russia annexing Crimea and starting its shadow war in Donetsk and Luhansk. And for many Ukrainians, they're like, well, we need some level of stability at this point. So then you have Poroshenko, who was a political insider. They call him the chocolate oligarch because he's an oligarch who made his money off candy, and he ran. And so many Ukrainians voted for him, even though they knew that he was a political insider, because at least they knew what to expect, right? And when someone has just annexed your territory and has launched a conflict on your eastern borders, you vote for what you know. And then after a few years, people said, well, you know what? Poroshenko is not really implementing the change that we want to see. We're frustrated. And so we're going to vote for someone new. And so Zelensky comes in as this dark horse. And of course, as is often the case, you need to have your patrons. And he was supported by this one oligarch, Kolomiski, something like that. I forgot his name. Which, whatever, that raised some concerns about whether or not Zelensky would be that oligarch's puppet. Eventually, Zelensky basically stripped that oligarch of his citizenship because he was engaged in a lot of corruption, and pushed back against them. And that assuaged a lot of the concerns there about whether or not he was beholden to that oligarch. So as of now, it seems like he's very independent. And then the Serving the People Party came in. And most of the people there who were part of that party had never had any political background. The whole servant of the people movement was like, we're regular Ukrainians who don't come from a political background. We're sick and tired of all this bullshit. It's either going to be Timoshenko or Poroshenko. And we know all these people. They've been infighting for 10 years. So we want something new. So they voted for the new party with all the new people. And then that party comes in, tries to implement some changes. But of course, there's some problems here because when everyone is new to politics, they're not experienced, right, with how to run a government. So there were some growing pains there as well, from my understanding, that maybe some of the candidates were not as serious as they could have been. If you want to make a comparison, think about all the newbies that were elected to the NDP opposition in 2011, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the NDP ran random students in Quebec who got elected as MPs as part of the Orange Wave. And now you have all these people who don't really know what they're doing. Similar situation here. Now, Zelensky ended up trying to put in some anti-corruption reforms. Now, we have to keep in mind that, Ukraine it has its problems. It has corruption issues. No one should deny that, but it's getting better over time. Slowly, but it is slowly getting better. And so what Zelensky tried to do is that there was this high court for anti-corruption. And that was implemented in the mid-2010s. And implementing that court was part of the process for Europeanization. You have to have some strong, legitimate anti-corruption courts to ensure that EU member states trust you enough to let you become part of their club. And so that court, it had this really interesting mechanism where they had I guess a council of some sort. It's been over a year since I wrote the story about this, so I'm fuzzy on the details. Yeah. But it had a council that was able to review some of the judges that were elected there to that court, so they can ensure that the court isn't just stuffed, with people of questionable backgrounds. And then, of course, that council is made up of some international observers as well. So, if you were a Russian propagandist, what you would probably say is that, this is all done by, Western orchestration, when really you can see this as being a pretty legitimate accountability mechanism.
Right.
So that court gets put together, and then under the Poroshenko government, they try to undermine it. And the way they try to undermine it is hilarious. They just didn't give the court the resources to function. And what I mean by that is that they didn't even have offices. They physically did not have a place to work. And so when the Zelensky government came in, they gave the court, these offices and helped them start to do their work, which doesn't imply that the work is perfect, but it's getting there. And then under the Zelensky government, they dissolved. There's this one key administrative court in Kyiv. So, Kyiv is, of course, the capital. And so if you're part of an administrative court in the region, you have much more influence than any other sort of administrative court. And so this sort of jurisdiction, this court that had jurisdiction over the Kyiv region was particularly known for being corrupt. And I know that the Zelensky government, managed to go investigate, and they got some recording of the lead judge there taking bribes or something like that. And they were able to eventually move on him and publish this. And I think they jailed him potentially. And then they dissolved the court because the institution was so corrupt. So you do have these small advances that are happening. Ukraine is moving in the right direction, but at the same time, it's not perfect. And I'll give you an example of this. And this shows the good side and the bad side of Ukraine. So there was a corruption scandal a few weeks ago or a few months ago where essentially some part of Ukraine's intelligence apparatus tried to do some operation to embarrass some journalists who were doing anti-corruption reporting. The journalists were supposed to come to a hotel, have a meeting there, and some rogue intelligence officers essentially went in and installed some cameras beforehand and recorded the journalists and tried to imply that they were doing drugs or something. And then what happened from there is that then they released that video. The journalists, who were all investigative journalists, were like, wait a second, how did they record us? What's going on? And so they went back to the hotel and they were actually able to get the material that had been used to record them. And they pieced together from surveillance footage that essentially, they had been spied on by some aspect of Ukrainian intelligence. And what they did is that then they created a mini documentary that they posted on YouTube being like, actually, we're Ukrainian journalists and we had we investigate corruption, and this particular part of the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus has tried to harass us and discredit us in this way. And that became a big story in Ukraine. And essentially everyone was talking about it. And I think it shows the good and bad side of Ukraine. And what I mean is that, like, in the bad side, it shows that there's still government corruption, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are still some people who have influence within certain parts of the government who try to retaliate against journalists who expose corruption. On the other hand, I think it's a testament to the strength of Ukrainian civil society and Ukraine's media, where journalists, when faced with this harassment, have the ability and freedom to push back, right? That they're able to go and investigate and, have enough confidence to go and post this YouTube video and create a ruckus. And I think it shows that, you have this civil society in Ukraine, which is very vigorously pushing for democratic. They're a democracy, but like pushing for stronger institutions, pushing against corruption. And they're able to do that because this is the kind of thing that, would not happen in a country like Russia or a country like China, right? Mm-hmm. If you were a journalist and you were targeted this way, you would just have to flee the country. But here, if you're trying to harass a journalist, you have to try to do it like in a clandestine manner. And then the journalist has enough power to push back and embarrass the hell out of you. So I think, once again, Ukraine, not a perfect country, has its flaws, but is moving in the right direction.
So what's your view on the allegation that, much of the aid money that's being sent to Ukraine isn't making it to either the military effort or the people? It's ending up in offshore accounts belonging to oligarchs. Do you think there's anything to that?
I think there's some small degree of corruption. I think it's significantly overblown. Mm-hmm. And the best way to think about this is that, these organizations, they tend to carefully audit where things go. And so everything that I've read from the people who are conducting the audits is they say that the vast majority of aid is going to where it needs to go. Mm-hmm. I think where there was corruption in the very beginning came to smaller items. So I'll explain to you like what corruption looked like for humanitarian aid at the very beginning of the war. So what would happen is that you would have these large organizations, and they would go and they would drop off large packages of aid at the Polish-Ukrainian border, but they didn't want to go into Ukraine. And so what would happen is that volunteers would come in and they would drive the aid to where it needs to go, right? And that was necessary because the big organizations did not want to do that work. And those people should be commended for that. I've known countless volunteers who have done that kind of work. And it's all for free, and they give all their time, and they care about the country. But it's also a pretty informal system without a lot of controls. And there were some people who would take advantage of that, and they would just take aid, and then they would try to resell it. So it was an issue. It was a minority of cases, for sure. The overwhelming majority of the stuff that went out went to where it needed to go, especially if people realize that you're a war profiteer, or if you're trying to do stuff like that, like the consequences are considerable, right? Because you're in a country with war. This is not like Canada, where like corruption is very abstract and people can forget about it because like they don't fully understand the consequences. Like this is the country at war where like corruption, for people, they know that this means that like soldiers will be killed, right? Their friends will be killed. So it's harder for that. But like that's the kind of corruption that I would see. But it wasn't that significant, maybe not. So, is some aid being diverted? Probably. Is it a tiny minority of the total aid? I think also probably. Mm-hmm. And one thing I do want to point out, especially for American listeners here, is that people kind of tend to forget that much of the aid, quote unquote, that is sent to Ukraine ends up actually staying in the US, right? Yeah. So the US will say, well, we've committed, tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. And people will think, oh, that's tens of billions of dollars to be embezzled. But actually what's happening is that money is being used to commission American contractors So the money is being reinvested back into the American economy, and then the finished products are then sent to Ukraine, in sense of weapons. So the total volume of money to be diverted is much smaller than people realize, because essentially most aid ends up just being domestic industrial stimulus, helping to create jobs on the ground, to produce stuff to help keep people safe.
You just answered my next question, because that's basically what's happening, right? A lot of that money is being sent to companies like Raytheon and others to, create the weapons that are then sent to Ukraine. And the reason I asked about the aid question is I read a story a while ago where they were talking about most of the weapons that are being sent to Ukraine are being sold on the black market, or being diverted before they even reach the military effort. And you have, soldiers and, bunkers sharing one rifle to four guys because they don't have enough weapons. And so what is essentially happening is that the billions of dollars that's being devoted to, support the war effort in Ukraine is really just going into the American economy, and the multinational, multi-billion dollar corporations are just, it's just another check that goes into the bank, right?
Well, I mean, I need to see your source for that claim that the majority of weapons are being diverted, because that flies in the face of everything else that I've read. Right.
Okay, yeah,
So,
I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you when we're done here. I read it like a year ago, and I take your word for it more than anybody, because you've actually been there, right? Like I said, it's difficult because so much of what makes up our universe now is speculation, right? This is what I think is happening, therefore I'm going to write it as if it's actually happening. And that's why I talk to people like you, because you're a journalist. It's your job to talk about what you actually see happening. And I think the story that you've told here today is a dose of the real world, right? The real world is very complicated, and it extends beyond our silly little ideological allegiances. The team that I'm on says this, therefore that's what I'm going to believe, whether it's true or not. And I think that's the mode of thought. I wouldn't even call it thought. It's the brainless following of these ideological narratives that have got us into the predicaments that we're in, right? I mean, you've spent a lot of your career your recent career covering the safe supply scandal. We see what's happening with that, and that's buried in ideology. That's deeply rooted in ideology. No logical human being can look at what's happening in Vancouver and go, this is a great idea, without ideology, right? And it's the same thing. We look at what's happening in Ukraine through an ideological lens, and it's impossible for us to see the reality, right?
well, that's the thing. I think it's important to focus on people who are actually on the ground. And I know that in some circles, there's a huge degree of skepticism towards journalists, right? And I can understand that. Many journalists can be ideological. I think that when it comes to conflict reporting, an underappreciated aspect of it, which most people don't know, is that a lot of the reporting that comes out from conflict zones, including Ukraine, is produced by freelancers who essentially go there because they have a passion for this work, because they want to make the world a better place. And then they go and then they produce stories, and then they sell their stories to large publications who underpay them, right? And they make very little money off of it, but they're basically doing this because they care. Right. So, I know a whole bunch of freelance journalists who basically just did what I did, well, not to the extent that I did, but they just relocated to Ukraine for several months, and they build connections. They find stories, they write it, they sell it to whoever will buy it. And it's a very ground up process. People think that journalism in this area is very top down, that essentially like the newspapers will dictate how we're going to cover it. That's not really the case. You do have some staff reporters, and they're kind of like a very privileged elites in this area. Essentially what they are is that they're reporters who come in, they stay in the nice hotel, they, have everything taken care of for them. They have security. They hire local producers, essentially local Ukrainians, who help them find the stories, because it's very difficult, if you're coming in as a random foreigner, to know where to look. Actually, that's a whole different scandal. At the very beginning of the war, a lot of local Ukrainians were kind of exploited by large news organizations because they worked them to the bone and were sometimes not the best employers to these people who were finding them stories. But anyways, yeah, so they'll do that. Like, there's the staff reporters. But a lot of the reporting, would be people like me, will be other people who just come in and be like, I want to go to Ukraine. I'll buy a ticket. I'll book an Airbnb and, and go and see what I can find. And that's not something where you can just orchestrate things. It's kind of weird when people have this idea that like, oh, the media is conspiring to tell us a particular narrative. Like the media in this case is literally a whole bunch of people who is like, I want to write something about it. I'm going to show up and sell it to whoever I can. Yeah.
Yeah. But in this, I don't think it's the writers, the journalists that are the problem here. Having spoken to yourself and Sam and many others, I view you guys as being like these, explorers, these journeymen. I like your story in Ukraine. I hope you write a book out of it one day, because it sounds very like a very Hemingway-esque sort of beautiful love story set against a war-torn country, right? But I think what it is it's that you have the outlets like the New York Times and others who are looking for something that supports a narrative that they're trying to construct. And you can kind of see it in the reporting, not that they do, but in the reporting that they share and in what they publish. And as a former columnist, I experienced this firsthand, right? Was people asking me to self-censor or to kind of manipulate what I was writing in a certain way in order for it to fit within whatever, narrative that the outlet I was writing for is trying to support or trying to propagate. Right. And so I think that's the beauty of things like Substack and other places, right? There's no more pressure on you to try to manipulate a story to kind of fit within a certain perspective. Do you see the same thing here, or do you think I'm a little bit out of touch?
I mean, I don't sit in on the editorial boards of these other newspapers, so I can't speak to that. What I would say is that if you want to bypass, those systems of control, and if you want to get the most direct sense of what people are seeing on the ground, you should just find these freelance journalists who are reporting from the ground, find them on Twitter and follow them directly.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the best way to get the most direct and the most accurate sense of what people are seeing on the ground. Not something that's been filtered through an editorial board or anything like that. People on Twitter will share their exact thoughts, and you can get a sense of the content that they're sharing of what the reality is. So when it comes to...
No, please keep going on.
Oh, I'm saying, when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, there is no shortage of journalists and other commentators who are in Ukraine who can give you an excellent sense of what is happening in the country.
Absolutely. So, okay. So what do you make of I'm sorry. I'm really trying to formulate this properly.
It's okay.
Yeah, no, I want to take my time with this because this is such a delicate subject. And, like for myself, it's like the Israel-Palestine scenario that's unfolding in front of us right now, right? It's so difficult to discuss because they're both right and they're both wrong for the exact same reasons, And with the conflict in Ukraine, I see Russia's perspective. I do, because I mean, if Russia showed up in Canada and was on the border with the United States and was, like we did with NATO, I mean, we pushed right up to the Russian border, we wouldn't exist anymore, right? Like that would be it. And so, I do understand the Russian perspective in that, it's about securing and protecting their borders from a perceived adversary, which is us. However, on the Ukrainian side, I mean, this is an independent nation. This is in a perfect world, this is a nation that is free to make decisions however it chooses, right? And that if Ukraine wants to join NATO, just like Poland, just like Finland, just like anybody else, they should be free to do so. But unfortunately, we have history, right? Especially the United States and Russia. I mean, virtually every war fought since Vietnam was a proxy war to some degree between the United States and Russia, right? Like, we've been at war for a very long time. And so this is just another chapter in that war. However, Ukraine does deserve its independence. Ukraine doesn't, but it's still really messy, because in Ukraine there's pockets of where it's mostly Russian speakers, right? Can we go into that, just a little bit of the geographic complexity of Ukraine? Because I think that's something that's kind of missed on us here in the West.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, once again, the east and the south of Ukraine is predominantly Russian speaking. The city that I live in Odessa, it's almost entirely Russian speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, you're cutting out for half a bit. Okay. I might.
Yeah, sorry. It's just a program that we're using. It uploads to the cloud as we're going. If I cut out, just keep going.
So let me just re-answer that. So here's the thing: is that Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine are predominantly Russian speaking. The city that I live in, Odessa, is overwhelmingly Russian speaking. I hear Russian all the time. Kharkiv, in the east where I was shelled, that's predominantly Russian speaking. But the language that you speak doesn't indicate your political allegiance, right? It would be like saying, well, Canada should be annexed by the United Kingdom because we speak English here. Mm-hmm. And the British speak English. Therefore, we should be in a big political union. Or it'd be like saying, I don't know, Algeria should be returned to France because there are some French speakers here. Like, I don't know where people get this idea that just because people speak Russian, they want to be part of Russia. Those are two very different things. Right. The Russian language's presence in Ukraine is very much a product of Russia's very deliberate attempt to colonize the region, right? We have to keep in mind, once again, that the Ukrainian language was banned under the Russian Empire. And if you wanted to succeed in the Russian Empire, you had to speak Russian. So, of course, the elites in Ukraine had to go and learn Russian, and they had to embrace that language. And major urban centers, which were integrated with the other parts of the empire, spoke a lot of Russian too. Now, one thing I want to go back on, is a bit of a digression, is the presence of the Russian minority in East Ukraine. So, like, East Ukraine is pretty industrialized, right? And so under the Soviet Union, what happened is that they brought in Russians into the area to work the area to help with the industrialization of Ukraine, not for the sake of Ukraine, but to help the Soviet Union in general. So you have economic migration coming to this place. You can see that as a form of colonization as well. And in the Holodomor, that predominantly impacted East Ukraine. So you had millions of Ukrainians dying predominantly in East Ukraine. And that created a deficit, that created empty houses. And who filled those empty houses? Russians who came in to go and further industrialize the region. So you have these different policies and political events that essentially Russify ever so slowly Eastern Ukraine. But even at its top, from my understanding, the Russian minority in Eastern Ukraine was never more than 25%, from my understanding. I think in Odessa, it's about 25% ethnically Russian. Now, if you look at the polling data in terms of how much support there was for joining Russia, so we have these numbers. We don't have to speculate. This is something that's been well studied. So before 2014, most people, were fairly warm towards Russia, but they didn't want to join Russia. So the most popular position was to have kind of an open border with Russia. For example, no visas, no customs, anything like that. So having some level of economic integration while still maintaining sovereignty. And support for actually joining Russia was always quite low. I think for Odessa, which was one of the most pro-Russian parts of Ukraine, it peaked at around 22%. From my understanding, in Donetsk and Luhansk, it peaked at around 30%, maybe 33%. So at its peak, support for Russia amongst the most pro-Russian parts of the country was a minority position. Mm. Then in comes, 2014, Maidan happens, Russia starts acting aggressively towards Ukraine. And a lot of people decide, actually, we don't want to be part of Russia anymore. They're not our friends. They are attacking us. So support for open borders with Russia collapses. Support for joining Russia collapses. I think in Odessa, it went down to like maybe 5%, 8%. I have to check these numbers. Once again, this was I wrote this article about a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And then when Russia launched the full-scale invasion, whatever residual support there was for joining Russia, that all disappeared. And you could see that in Kharkiv. So from the people who I spoke with, they estimated that, maybe about 20 to 25% of the population in Kharkiv was very pro-Russian or fairly pro-Russian before the war. And then they changed their minds. And this was a very emotional process because the country that you thought was your friend is bombing you, is killing your friends. You're in a bunker and you hear explosions and you're terrified to leave because of this country that you thought was an ally. One guy who's a friend of mine, he ran that volunteer organization that was doing the medical deliveries. He described the process as being very, powerful. You had people who were at first confused. They say, why is brat fighting brat? Why is brother fighting brother? And after an initial period of confusion, they couldn't digest what was happening for the first few weeks. They realized that, actually Russia is a fucking enemy. And then they cried and they wept because they realized they'd been wrong all along. So that was a big process here. In Odessa, which let's say 15 years ago was quite pro-Russian, now they don't love Russians at all. Why would they? Mm-hmm. They bomb us. Mm-hmm. My friends, my boyfriend, everyone, they don't have electricity. Well, they didn't have electricity for a full winter. They have to worry about their friends dying. So any love for Russia has all but disappeared. And just because some people speak Russian, that doesn't change things at all.
That's a fantastic point. And it's one that I hadn't really thought about because you're absolutely right. Just because I speak English doesn't mean I need to, Canada needs to give up its independence and join Britain. And just because people in Quebec speak French doesn't mean they belong to France. You're absolutely right there. So what's your view on the allegation that there was a peace deal on the table and then Boris Johnson was sent by the U.S. State Department to kill it? Is there anything to that? Have you read into it at all? And what's your perspective?
Yeah, actually, I wrote an article about this about 3 months ago.
I know. I read it. I'm just kind of setting you up.
Oh, okay, so you did read it. Okay, yeah. No, I mean, look, it's a bullshit allegation. So essentially what happened is this quote unquote peace deal, first of all, was nowhere near being completed. Second of all, it was essentially a request for Ukraine to surrender. So what had happened essentially is that, the Ukrainians and the Russians, they had sent high level representatives to meet and try to figure out some general framework for what peace could potentially look like. Right. And if they were able to establish this framework, then it'd be sent to Zelensky and Putin, and then they would work out the details. So when people say that a peace deal was nearing completion, what they mean is that the framework was maybe getting to the point where it could be sent to Zelensky and Putin, where they would hammer out the details. But a framework is just the first step, right? Mm-hmm. And it's perhaps the easiest step, because the devil is always in the details for any peace deal, right? So for people to say that peace was almost achieved in early 2022 is like saying that you've built a house just because you have a hole in the ground and set some foundations. It's more complicated than that. Now, the second thing is the substance of this quote unquote peace deal was essentially requesting Ukraine to demilitarize itself that would make a future invasion all but inevitable. So essentially what the Russians were doing is that they were saying, okay, we will retreat from your country, but in exchange, you have to reduce the size of your military by like 75% or something like that. No, maybe 66%. You have to reduce the size of your tank fleet by like, I think 80%, something ridiculous like that. Once again, don't quote me on these numbers. I don't remember the specifics. I can pull up the article if you want. But they were essentially saying that Ukraine should reduce its internal army to the point where it could never defend itself. And then Russia said, well, we should have security guarantors. And so we'll put together a coalition of other countries that will guarantee Ukraine's security should it get into a conflict again. And Russia wanted to be one of those security guarantors. Now, no other country had really signed up for this. And it's unclear if any other country would, because think about it. You're putting yourself in a position where you're being asked to guarantee the security of Ukraine after Ukraine has voluntarily demilitarized itself. Mm-hmm. So it's an impossible position to be in, because there's a very big risk that Russia will just invade Ukraine in the next few years. And then because the Ukrainians have no army, the entire burden of defending Ukraine falls upon you. That's politically unpopular. It's not tenuous. Mm-hmm. It's just not something anyone wants to do. So no one had really signed on to this yet. And what was very notable is that what the Russians wanted is they said, if Ukraine is invaded by anyone, someone, who knows, who could that person be, is that the security guarantors can intervene to protect Ukraine, but that would require the consent of every guarantor. And Russia wanted to be a guarantor. So essentially what they were saying is that you should demilitarize yourself. You should commit to not entering any defensive alliances, but we'll create this system where we'll put together like 5 countries that will guarantee your security, including us, but we'll have a veto over them to prevent them from defending you, should we invade you, which we definitely promise that we won't do, just like how we promised a few months ago how we would never invade you. Mm. It was bullshit. And then Boris Johnson said it was bullshit. And he said, this is your strongest moment. You should defend yourself because this is a bullshit peace deal. And this is your best chance at this point. Plus, last thing, sorry, I know I've been monologuing, but then Bucha happened, right? So like the Ukrainians knew that occupation was bad. And then the Russians, got kicked out of Bucha. And then they found over 300 civilians executed, their bodies rotting on the ground. And at that point, the Ukrainians were like, absolutely not. There's no way we can give up land or do a peace deal. Or like cede any territory. So even if Zelensky had wanted to sign a peace deal, he wouldn't have had the political mandate to. He probably would have been overthrown because the Ukrainians were so pissed at seeing civilians being massacred. They're like, well, we have to see this through. We have to defend ourselves.
The world is so messy. It's such a messy place, and like talking to you today has opened me up to so many different ideas and concepts and just facts that I was unaware of. And I think a lot of people listening too were unaware of a lot of what you've shared, because it's difficult being here in the West now, because like I said, everything has an ideological slant to it. Right. It's what team is this information coming from? And can we classify any of what we're receiving anymore as being information? Because it's all got its roots. It all has roots in something nefarious. Right. So I guess I have 2 final questions for you. One not so fun, one a little more fun. So we'll start with the not so fun. How do you see this ending?
Ooh, it's hard to say. I think it really depends on what the Republicans do, right? So the Republicans have been fucking around. They've been blocking weapons to Ukraine. I am very worried that if American aid to Ukraine does not resume, that the Russians will have a breakthrough and that they'll occupy pretty much all of Ukraine up until Western Ukraine. They might leave that as a rump state. That was part of their initial plans, which were leaked. And that would mean mass terror. That would mean a lot of people who I know potentially dying. That would mean the city that my boyfriend lives in, that I've spent the last year and a half living in being destroyed. And that would also mean global instability. Moldova would probably end up, being annexed after that. The Baltics following that. And then that would mean a very unstable world where we might see direct confrontation with a larger NATO state like Poland. I think it's a very real concern. And it's part of the reason why these Eastern European nations have invested so much money into supporting Ukraine. So that's the worst case scenario, and that seems to be a very possible scenario. Or, for example, they'll do like a quote unquote peace deal, where they'll cede a lot of the land, and then people will get bored and they'll pay attention to something else, and the Ukrainians won't have enough support to secure their borders, and you'll have another invasion in 4, 5, 6 years, right? So those are the more negative options. There's also the possibility that if there's a breakthrough by the Russians and the U.S. isn't doing its job here and helping to protect its allies, that the Europeans might send their soldiers in. So France, for example, has recently started to use rhetoric implying that they might send in troops to defend Ukraine. Macron has said that he wouldn't rule out sending in troops. And I know on my end, when I heard that, I kind of wanted to cry with joy. He mentioned Odessa specifically. He's like, if the Russians get close to Kyiv or Odessa, maybe France will send in troops to defend those cities. And I felt so grateful at the thought that finally they're taking this seriously and finally they'll give enough of a shit to protect these cities and these people. But if you have Western European countries coming in and sending their troops, or Eastern European countries too, I mean, Poland would probably want to send in troops as well. That means more escalation.
Yeah.
So that's another possibility. We're starting to see the world is entering a very dangerous place right now. Our adversaries are doing the best that they can to undermine Western power. There's a new triumvirate of Iran, China, and Russia. They want to change the status quo. They want to be on top. And they're willing to launch wars for that. And I think that if Ukraine falls, then we'll see more of that. Now, the alternative is that, we give the Ukrainians the weapons that they need. We stop just giving them little bits and scraps here and there. And they can hold off and maybe they can liberate more of their territory, although it's hard because the counteroffensive stalled. So who knows? I don't know. You know what? Forget everything I said. It's all up in the air.
Yeah. And there's also the real concern about, most of the Ukrainian men dying in this war, right? They're going younger and younger and older in terms of conscripting people because so many of their military aged men have died in this conflict, right?
I mean, I think people kind of exaggerate that. I mean, this is the country that has 30 million people. So, and when you look at the number of people who have died, it's actually not that high. So there's about 500,000 casualties. No, 400,000? 400 to 500,000 casualties on the Russian side. I stopped tracking that after a few months. And then on the Ukrainian side, it's about 200 to 300,000. And keep in mind, casualties, it's people who, not all of them are dead. Some of them lost a limb. But okay, so let's say there's 250,000 Ukrainians, 300,000 who are out of commission. This is a country with 30 million people left. We still don't know exactly what the population is because a lot of them, have to flee abroad. So the casualties represent 1% of your total population, or 2% of your total male population. So there's still a very deep pool of people to conscript from, and a deep pool of people to fight should they want to. The main issue is just, finding people who want to fight. People do want to defend their country, but there's also a fear, right? People don't want to die on the front line. And that's been the big conversation right now, is about how aggressively should you conscript, and what's the best way to bolster the military, while respecting the fact that, people still try to maintain the economy and are scared to fight.
And so, we've all seen the videos on, X and other social media platforms of Ukrainian men being, picked up, kicking and screaming off of the street in Ukraine, the idea that being that they've been conscripted into the army and they're going to be sent to the front lines. Are those legitimate videos that we're seeing, or do you see them as being more propaganda than anything?
I mean, it's stuff that happens. Um,
Mm-hmm.
is it nearly as common as some people on Twitter make it out to be? No. Uh, what's happening right now is that they're trying to conscript people, and people are trying to avoid conscription because that's a rational thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's imagine for yourself, if you're trying to be sent to the front lines, it can be terrifying. But most people handle this with a sense of grace. I've had friends who've been conscripted, and obviously, it's shitty when you get sent to the front lines, but they've accepted it. But these dramatic situations of people kicking and screaming, that's something that I've never personally seen, and I think it's a pretty rare thing that is being blown out of proportion on X to exaggerate some of the problems here with conscription.
And so I guess second part of this is, judging from what you see on X and other places, how much of our perspective on this has been shaped by propaganda?
Oh, a whole fucking bunch. Like, there's the whole like Nazi bullshit, which okay, the Russians are very invested into portraying the Ukrainians as having some big problem with Nazis. And, as someone who has lived there for 2 years, you know what? I have not once seen any issue there. Like, not once. And I've interviewed populations that have dealt, are minority populations. Like, as much as I'm a conservative writer, I also like to look at how minority groups experience war. So, at the very beginning of the war, I interviewed LGBTQ activist leaders in Kyiv, right? And all of them fucking hated the Nazi narrative. They're like, this is ridiculous. This is bullshit. None of this is true. In Odessa has a big Jewish population. Approximately 5% of the population is Jewish. I have close ties with Chabad Odessa, the main Jewish organization there. I've written several articles about them. I attended the opening of a Jewish school in November, which didn't require any security, by the way. You couldn't do that in Canada. If you opened up a Jewish school in Canada, you'd have to hire security. You didn't have to do that in Ukraine. And I asked them about the Nazi thing, and they're like, yeah, people who think that there's Nazis everywhere in Ukraine need to get their head checked. We welcome you to come to Odessa and talk to us. We welcome you to come to our Jewish school and our Jewish university. This is bullshit. But what happens on Twitter is that people will sometimes go and they'll take, this is a country of 40 million people, 30 million now, lost a whole bunch of them. And they'll find a few cherry-picked examples, and then they'll keep on playing the same things again and again and again and again to create this false narrative. And from my end, as someone who is writing on the center right in Canada, I get kind of annoyed when Canadian conservatives fall for it, because we know how often, people will try to cherry pick things to claim that a group is Nazis when they're not. With a good example of that being with the trucker protest, right? Some media found one guy with a Nazi flag and then played it again and again and again ad nauseum to claim that all the truckers were Nazis. Right. And that wasn't true. That was a lie. Same thing here. Another way that, let's say, for example, Twitter propaganda works is that you might see on Twitter, you'll see some videos of life being fairly comfortable in Ukraine, and say, well, what kind of war is this? So what I always tell people is that there are essentially two Ukraines right now. So there's the Ukraine on the front lines, and near the front lines where life is horrific every single day. People die every single day. There's destruction every single day. And then the further you get from there, the more of a sense of normalcy there is. So, for example, in Odessa, we're 4 hours from the front line, and we're relatively safe. We're not as safe as Lviv in the West. That is very safe, but we're relatively safe. And so there's an economy that functions, and there are restaurants that are open, that are beautiful, and people will go to the beach, because you can't just cry for 2 years. You have to move on, and you have to live. And then what happens is that people take videos of all of this and say, well, what kind of war is this? Well, I mean, like it's still a war. You still have missiles coming in. It's just that war is not evenly distributed across the entire country.
Right.
The way that I like to illustrate it, if you're, from Ontario, is that imagine if Quebec suddenly decided to invade Ontario, and then they started shelling Ottawa all the time, and people in Ottawa were dying every day. And then they invaded like Ontario through the United States and surrounded Toronto for like on three sides, and they got pushed back. And after being pushed back, they just sent missiles into Toronto, let's say once or twice a week, right? And then if you're in Windsor, you're like very far away. Maybe you got a missile like once every 1 or 2 months, right?
Right.
So in like Toronto, you'll have missiles come in every once in a while. Maybe they'll kind of hit like things here and there, but statistically speaking, you'll be okay because, it's a big city. There's a lot of people. And so you live your life, but then people will take videos of you eating at a cafe saying the war's not real. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, people are dying all the time.
Right.
So that's another way that Twitter propaganda works, right? Is that trying to take out that context. That's really important for thinking about things. Actually, to use an anecdote from my own life, well, from my partner's life, I just talked to him a few days ago. I mean, we talk every day, but a few days ago, they sent in 2 missiles into Odessa, and asked him how his day was. And he said, yeah, it was a beautiful day. I went to the seaside, grabbed a coffee, saw some friends for dinner. 2 missiles landed in the city, but we intercepted them. And it was such a beautiful day. No one wanted to have that ruined. So they kept on living. Right. So it's pretty fucked up, but people are resilient. But then people take a video and say, oh, where's the war?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost like there's a war, there's conflict in Toronto and people taking video of people on the beach in Vancouver, right? It's the same fucking country, but completely lots of space between, Adam, I have one final question. Can you finish this love story for us? You go back to Ukraine. What happens? Fill us in.
I go back to Ukraine. I go back in the middle of May. It'll be almost 2 years. I love my partner. We'll just spend time.
No, sorry. Back when you returned to Toronto, and you said you ended up going back to Ukraine for a year. Can you fill us in on that last year that you spent in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, essentially, I came back to Odessa. It was beautiful, and I paid for an Airbnb, which was a waste of money since I spent all my time at his place. Right. And then I was like, yeah, this would be a great chance for me to get to know this person. We spoke every day while I was away, all that stuff. And then I got invited to go to Taiwan. So I went to Taiwan, came back. My mom was in Serbia because, we're Serbian, and she always wanted to see Odessa. And it was relatively peaceful. So I said, okay, you should come to Odessa. Come see the city, see where I'm staying, meet my boyfriend. And she did. She's also like kind of pro-Russian. So that was really frustrating. And I was like, oh, maybe you'll stop calling them Nazis if you come to the country. And so she came with me to Ukraine, and she came with me to Odessa. And so suddenly I have my mom there in Odessa. And she was a bit worried because, she's wondering if she's a war tourist. And it's like, well, I mean, the hotels need the money. So you're stimulating the economy. And then I told her it would be fine. I was like, there's right now, most of the wars in the East, Odessa hasn't been hit by missiles in a while. You'll be here for only a week. Like, it won't be that bad. And then the morning that we arrived, because we took an overnight train, I open up my phone and I see kamikaze drone used in Odessa for the first time ever. And I was like, fuck. So suddenly they start sending kamikaze drones into the city like all week. And they're all intercepted. Like the first one got in, but they started intercepting them. And my mom was terrified at first. And then by the end of it, I was like sending her a video. They intercepted kamikaze drone. Here's like the plume of smoke in the air. She's like, yeah, I'm just at the cafe. Yeah. So she left. I ended up staying for about a year. Then the main thing that happened is that, so I ended up going to another trip to Azerbaijan. And when I was in Azerbaijan in November of 2022, that's when they started bombing the electrical infrastructure in the Odessa region. So people stopped having power. And I went to the nearest camping store and I said, give me every light you have. So I came back to Odessa with a backpack full of lights, like little orbs.
Yeah.
And so in Odessa in the winter, so what would happen is we didn't have electricity. And we would have electricity in like maybe 9 hours a day in total and in 3-hour blocks. So, be from like maybe 9 a.m. to 12, from like 3 to 6, and like maybe from like 12 to 3 or whatever. So you never knew when the fuck you were going to get electricity. There was a schedule, but it didn't really, no one really followed the schedule. Like you couldn't actually use it. And so what would happen is that when there'd be power, things would be relatively normal. We'd charge our shit. Everyone bought a whole bunch of power banks. Our flashlights had rechargeable batteries. And then when there was no power, things got a bit more difficult. Now, it wasn't so bad for us because we had gas. Like we had a gas stove, we had gas heating. So when we didn't have power, we would still cook by flashlight. But we could still cook. Some people were not so lucky. And we had like a light in every room because of all the lights in Azerbaijan. So we just like turn on these different orbs or whatever. So what we would do is that, we would go and I would torrent as many films as I could when we had power. And then in the evenings when we didn't have electricity, we would just watch films together. And, we'd make a big pot of tea by just boiling a pot with like ginger or whatever. And we'd just watch that and we made it nice. It got aggravating after, obviously, we didn't have as bad as other people, but obviously when you don't have electricity and it's like, it just keeps on going and going and going. It's a lot. The data stopped basically working. Like you could barely use your phone data. So a lot of freelancers ended up leaving, like a lot of women who were working in like marketing or social media, they ended up going because they couldn't function in that kind of society. A lot of the restaurants and cafes, they all had generators. So you could still live a relatively normal-ish, like some of the trappings of normal life were still there. So you could go to the cafe and they'd have a generator, and like everywhere in the city, you would just hear generators and you could smell gasoline everywhere. And then in every cafe, people would just be charging their phones and charging their power banks. And over time, people managed to somehow make it work. Obviously, it wasn't normal. And when you're walking in a city and everything is completely dark, and this is a city that is cosmopolitan with 1 million people, and you can't see anything, it's a lot. But people are resilient, and they made this work. So yeah, we just kind of did all that. And there were a few days when we didn't have water. And we had a couple's argument about that. Because I'm a bit of a slob, and I said, okay, we have 30 liters of water in various jugs in our kitchen, and I'm thinking, okay, how long is that water going to last us? Do we need to flush the toilet every single time? And he's like, we should. And I said, but what if we run out of water? And he said, no, we're not going to run out of water. And I said, well, how do you know? He said, the water will be on tomorrow or the day after. And I said, well, what if it's not? And he said, it doesn't matter. You have to flush the toilet every single time. So in the end, he won. Yeah, he's my better half when it comes to cleanliness. But silly, stupid stuff like this still exists. Or for example, there were some times where there would be rumors that there would be a particularly big strike. So they would always hit every Monday or Tuesday. And then you wouldn't have electricity for the work week. And then the power would come on by Friday or Saturday. And then them being assholes, they'd blow it all up on Monday again. And so, we had a sense of when it was coming and we thought it was particularly bad. We're like, oh, are we going to have water? So my boyfriend would message me and it's like, can you fill the bathtub today? So we have water, right? And there were like maybe 2 or 3 times when we ran out of water, but it wasn't that bad because we filled up the bathtub. So we had all of that.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. So there you go.
So present day, he's still over there. Are you planning on bringing him to Canada? Are you planning on going back or?
Well, I'm going back in mid-May, staying for most of the summer. We're trying to do an application for permanent residency. The main issue is that we can't get married in Ukraine because gay marriage is not legal yet. Uh, and actually, it was interesting. I thought I found a loophole. So I realized because of the Mormons or some shit, you can get married online in Utah. Like,
Right.
yeah, you can like literally go to a website. There's all this like a cottage industry, and they'll just within 24 hours they'll arrange for you to get on a Zoom call with a Utah official who will officiate your marriage, and it'll be
Right.
legal under Utah law. It'll be a valid American marriage, and like you can get like $50 off or something like that. So I thought I figured it out. Okay, I was like, we'll just get married and we'll get married under Utah law via Zoom, and then we'll start the PR process. But
Right.
it turns out that that's not valid for immigration purposes because it's affiliated with marriage fraud and human trafficking, which is understandable. But then I realized that actually, if you can show that there's a real reason why you can't get married or be in common law, you can use a third route, which is like a conjugal partner. So we're trying that route. So that's how things are going right now. When I left for Ukraine, my family said, "Don't bring home a husband." And I said, "No, of course not. That's ridiculous." And that seems to be where things are going.
Well, what you should do is just, send him through Afghanistan, give him a fake Afghanistan passport, maybe have him shoot an American soldier. He can come to Canada and Trudeau will give him like $10 million. And then you guys are set forever.
Oh God, that's dark.
I know. I'm sorry. That's a bad joke. But Adam, man, thank you so much. You know what? Can I ask you one last question? Because I've kept you for almost 2 hours now. I just want to ask you one last question. And we're kind of going back in time here. What is your perspective on Gonzalo Lira? I'm not sure if you heard the story. He was a Chilean-American journalist. Yeah, and he died in custody in Ukraine. Do you know anything about that story? Do you have a perspective on it? Any ideas of why what happened to him?
Yeah, he had a terrible reputation. So essentially, as a journalist, if you work in Ukraine, of course there are certain rules. And one of the main rules is that you are not supposed to photograph any sensitive military installations, right? Because it's a war, right? And people the information security is a very important thing, right? So anything that you photograph or video record, if it's sensitive, you need to have permission for that first. So what Lira did again and again and again is that he kept on recording sensitive locations and sensitive formations in Kharkiv, in that region, which is clearly and reasonably illegal. And he refused to stop. So then he got arrested. And then he made a big fuss about it, saying he's being politically persecuted. And I was like, I'm sorry, dude, you just broke the law that everyone knows and that everyone else follows. Like, look, I'm banned from going to Russia, but if I wasn't, and if I was a journalist and I went to Russia and continued to photograph and video record sensitive Russian military foundations after they told me again and again and again that that's illegal and I shouldn't do that, and then I got arrested, it'd be pretty shitty for me to say, oh, that's political persecution, right? Mm-hmm. But this is what he did. And then he was known for being unhealthy. He smoked like packs and packs and packs of cigarettes a day. So the fact that he died of like a heart attack, not particularly surprising. Unfortunate, but not particularly surprising. But I think that some people have kind of like latched on to this narrative that like Lira, is some sort of political dissident or is being persecuted. I don't think that's true. Out of all of the journalists that I have met, no one, respects him in any way or thinks that he is some sort of big victim. And keep in mind that journalists are very sensitive to these things. Mm-hmm. But he was basically perceived as being some grifter who was being disrespectful to some very basic rules about how to operate in a war zone.
Adam, dude, thank you. Because I was one of those guys who latched onto that story and was like, look at what they're doing to journalists in Ukraine. And you just cleared up a lot for me. And I guarantee you in the comments below this podcast, everybody's going to call you a leftist now. But but you're actually a conservative. So,
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Like, I don't understand why is it a leftist perspective to like protect our allies? Like, why? Okay, why is it? Like, I don't know what the fuck happens to the party of Ronald Reagan. Like, the Russians are not our friends, right?
Yeah. I think the major problem is the ideological elements. I really do believe it. I believe that both the right and the left have become religious factions unto themselves, and these are religions now. They're not centers for critical thought, right? As much as we talk about woke neoliberalism being a cult, the right has become a cult as well. They've slid into the same cult behavior. And there's people like me and people like you. I consider myself center left. You consider yourself center right. But I think you and I have far more overlap just because we're open-minded individuals. And it's unfortunate that this is what our world has become. We've become a society controlled by cults and a culture informed by zealots. That's just what it is.
It would be really nice if everyone could just be a bit more normal. Unfortunately, that seems to be a big ask.
And that's it. Let's kill it there. Adam, before you go, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. I mean, you can find me on Twitter. I'm Adam Zivo, but my Twitter handle is Zivo Adam. So that's Z-I-V as in Victor, O, Adam. So yeah, Zivo Adam. And I also have a nonprofit that focuses on drug policy, because that's the other thing that I do. Basically showing people that our government is giving out a whole bunch of free opioids that are being resold to kids. It's super fucked up. That's an entirely different thing. But if you want to follow any of the stuff that I'm doing there, you can follow the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. That's www.responsibledrugpolicies.com, or Break the Needle, which is our Substack, which is breakingneedles.com.
Adam, it's always a pleasure, man. And I want to talk to you again in a month or two. And I want to follow up on the safe supply story with you, because as always, the plot thickens and things are not as simple as they seem, or as our more liberal leaning governments would want us to believe. So until then, Adam, thank you, man. It's an honor to talk to you, man. You opened my eyes on so many things today, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show.